The transfer of King Charles from one wing of the hospital to another was not a medical routine. It was the quiet moment the monarchy stopped pretending that time was still on its side. The corridor did not fall silent because of the machines. It fell silent because of what William and Catherine were seen carrying out of that room, wordless, unblinking, and no longer able to hide the weight behind their eyes. For the first time in a generation, the heir and his wife stepped into a hospital wing not as visitors, not as symbols, not as future occupants of a distant throne, but as the two people now expected to hold an entire institution steady through a night no press office had rehearsed. Behind them, a schedule was being rewritten in real time. Ahead of them, a father, a sovereign, and a fading center of gravity waited in a room that had suddenly become the most important address in the United Kingdom. What they revealed in the minutes that followed was not a diagnosis. It was a truth the palace had been swallowing for months. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room they entered was small, warmer than expected, and stripped of every ceremonial marker that usually surrounded the sovereign. There were no red boxes on the side table. There were no aids pressed against the walls. There was no standard from any regiment, no household crest, no polished silver tray of correspondence waiting for signature. In their place stood a single narrow bed, a soft lamp angled toward the ceiling, and a chair pulled close enough that a hand could rest on a hand without effort. That mattered because in the private grammar of the monarchy, the removal of objects is never accidental. Every folder that disappears, every pen that is quietly withdrawn, every unopened dispatch that is redirected to another desk tells the household that a threshold has been crossed. And the threshold in that room had been crossed hours before William and Catherine were called. William did not speak when he first stepped inside. He looked at his father, then at the empty stand where the dispatch box would normally have rested. A dispatch box, in simple terms, is the leather-bound case in which the sovereign receives the confidential papers of state each day, and its presence or absence in a sick room is the single clearest signal of who is still functioning as monarch and who is being gently, carefully moved aside. The box was not there. It had not been there for some time. And William, who had trained himself for years to read the silent architecture of the household, understood immediately that his role that evening had shifted from son to something heavier, something colder, something for which no ceremony had ever been rehearsed. Catherine crossed the room second. She did not go to the bed first. She went to the window, drew the curtain by a hand's width, and looked down at the small service courtyard where an unmarked car had been waiting since morning. That mattered because the car had been arranged in advance of any public announcement, and its presence meant that the decision to transfer the king had not been made in the moment. It had been made quietly days earlier by a small circle of medical advisors and household officers who had chosen not to alarm the country until the movement itself was complete. Catherine let the curtain fall. She turned back toward the bed, and in the softness of her turn, the entire household read a message that no press release would ever carry. The future consort had already accepted what the future king was still fighting to name. For Charles, lying on that narrow bed with his hands folded across the blanket, the evening arrived not as a medical event but as a moral one. He had spent his entire life waiting for the throne, and now, having occupied it for so brief a chapter, he was being asked to hand its working machinery to his son without a ceremony, without a proclamation, without any of the constitutional theater that usually accompanied such transitions. He understood the arithmetic of illness. He understood that a monarch who could not read his boxes, could not receive his prime minister, could not sign what needed signing, was already a monarch in the past tense. What he did not yet understand was how to say that aloud to the boy he had once carried on his shoulders through the gardens at Highgrove. For William, the moment refracted differently. He was not thinking of the throne. He was thinking of the last conversation he had held with his father in a private study months earlier, when Charles had reached across a desk and pressed a small folded note into his palm without explanation. William had not opened it that night. He had not opened it the next morning. He had carried it in the inner pocket of his jacket for weeks, feeling its edges every time he sat down, every time he stood up, every time he was asked a question he could not yet answer. And now, standing in this stripped-down room, he understood that the note had never been about instructions. It had been about permission. For Catherine, the refraction was quieter still. She had spent the previous year becoming, without ever asking to become, the emotional anchor of a family that had run out of anchors. Her own illness had taught her the specific vocabulary of hospital rooms, the way light moves across a monitor, the way nurses lower their voices when they think no one is listening, the way a spouse learns to read a chart by its silences rather than its numbers. She did not need anyone to explain to her what the transfer meant. She had lived inside its rehearsal. And so when she finally sat down beside Charles and placed her hand lightly over his, she did so with the authority of a woman who had already survived the exact fear he was now entering. For Harry, thousands of miles away and unreachable by the household's usual channels, the moment arrived as a phone call that was placed but not answered, a voicemail that was left but not retrieved in time, and a private ache that would later be described, through a documented family account, as the sensation of a door closing in a house he no longer lived in. That mattered because the transfer of the king was also, in its quiet way, the transfer of a family. And the family that gathered around that bed was smaller than the one that had once posed for photographs on a Balmoral lawn. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held 6 months earlier in a private dining room at Clarence House, on an evening when Charles had insisted, against the advice of his physicians, on hosting William and Catherine himself. The table had been set for 4, though only 3 chairs were occupied. The 4th place had been laid for Camilla, who had been called away by an obligation the household had described as unavoidable. Charles had not corrected the empty chair. He had left it exactly as it was, the napkin folded, the glass polished, the cutlery aligned, as if the absence itself were a kind of guest. He had spoken that night of the rain in the past tense. Not deliberately, not theatrically, but in the small grammatical slips that a careful listener could not miss. He had said when the crown passes rather than if. He had said the next rain rather than a future rain. He had said at one point that the country would need a steadier hand than his own. And when Catherine had gently protested, he had smiled the particular smile of a man who has already made peace with a decision he has not yet announced. William had said nothing. He had watched his father lift a glass, replace it, and align it perfectly with the rim of the plate below. That gesture, small and unremarkable to any outside observer, had told William that his father was already rehearsing the choreography of a departure. The dinner had ended without ceremony. Charles had walked them to the door himself, which was itself unusual, and had paused on the threshold to place a hand on William's shoulder. He had held it there for a fraction longer than any greeting required. He had said only, "You will know when." And then he had turned back into the house, and the door had closed, and the corridor had returned to the ordinary hush of a residence that had, without anyone naming it, begun its own long farewell. That was the seed. That was the moment the current crisis had been quietly planted, months before any hospital corridor knew its name. And when William stepped into the sick room on the night of the transfer, the sentence his father had spoken at that doorway rose back through his memory with the force of an instruction finally decoded. You will know when. He had not known then, he knew now. The confrontation, when it came, was not a confrontation in any traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic revelation shouted across a bed. There was only a long silence, held between father and son, in which the entire weight of a monarchy passed from one set of shoulders to another, without a single document being signed. Charles looked at William. William looked at Charles. Neither man blinked. Neither man reached for the other's hand. And in that stillness, which lasted perhaps 40 seconds and perhaps 40 years, the king admitted, without a word, what he had not been able to admit to his ministers, his physicians, or his own reflection. He was tired. He was frightened. He was ready. William, for his part, did not accept the admission with triumph. He accepted it with grief. He lowered himself into the chair beside the bed, leaned forward, and rested his forearms on his knees in the posture of a man receiving news he had already known for months, but had refused to name. Catherine placed a hand on the back of his neck, briefly, and then withdrew it. That mattered because in the household's private choreography, a hand withdrawn is often more eloquent than a hand held. It said, "I am here, but this is yours to carry." The king closed his eyes, and in the closing of those eyes, the room became, for the first time that evening, a room in which the transfer had already occurred. Outside the room, in the corridor where the private secretaries and medical officers had assembled without instruction, the machinery of the household had already begun to move. A folder that had, for months, been kept in a locked drawer in a small office on the ground floor of Buckingham Palace was quietly withdrawn and placed inside a leather satchel. The folder, in simple terms, contained the contingency papers for a regency, the constitutional arrangement by which the heir assumes the working duties of the sovereign when the sovereign is unable to perform them. Its existence was not a secret. Its withdrawal, however, was. And the withdrawal that evening meant that a document which had lived in theory for years was now being carried, physically, along a corridor toward a room where a decision would be made. A private secretary crossed the corridor with an empty engagement diary tucked beneath one arm. He did not look at anyone as he passed. He did not need to. The diary, which had been full to overflowing only a week earlier, had been quietly cleared of the king's public commitments for the coming month, and the cleared pages had been replaced with the heir's engagements, rewritten in a hand that no press officer would ever release. That mattered because a diary in the household is not a calendar. It is a map of who the country is currently being asked to see. And the map had been redrawn. A chair in the state dining room at Buckingham Palace, several miles away, had been removed from a rehearsal for an upcoming reception. It had not been announced. It had not been photographed. It had simply been carried out by two staff members, placed in a storage room behind the kitchens, and covered with a soft cloth. The chair had been the king's. The reception would continue without him, and the space where the chair had stood would be occupied at the next rehearsal by a chair marked with the initials of the Prince of Wales. Small objects, quiet movements, no cameras, no statements, no warnings. And yet, taken together, they formed the unmistakable architecture of a rain-changing hands. The second warning arrived shortly after midnight, in the form of a phone call placed from the hospital to a senior official at Downing Street. The call was brief. It was not, by any measure, a formal notification, but it carried enough weight that within an hour, a small group of officials had gathered in a room in Whitehall to review the arrangements that had been prepared months earlier for exactly this scenario. The arrangements had a name, though the name had never been spoken outside the room in which it lived. They concerned the precise sequence of steps by which the country would be informed, the government would be reassured, and the Commonwealth would be steadied in the event that the king's condition required a formal transfer of duties. That mattered because until that phone call, the transfer had been a private matter, contained within the walls of a hospital and the discretion of a family. After that phone call, it became a matter of state, and a matter of state, once begun, cannot be reversed by a family's later change of heart. William was informed of the call at approximately midnight. He was standing in the small anteroom outside his father's suite, drinking a cup of tea that had gone cold in his hand. Catherine was seated in the chair beside him, her head resting against the wall, her eyes closed but not asleep. The private secretary who delivered the news did so in a single sentence, spoken barely above a whisper. William nodded once. He set the tea down on the side table. He did not look at Catherine. He walked back into his father's room and closed the door behind him. What passed between father and son in that second private meeting has not been recorded, and will not be. But the household staff who stood in the corridor outside the door reported, through a documented internal account preserved in the household's own records, that the silence from within the room was of a particular kind, the kind that follows not an argument but a decision. When William emerged, some 20 minutes later, his face was composed, his posture was straight, and his eyes were red in a way that no photograph would ever capture. He walked past Catherine without stopping. He walked past the private secretary without speaking. He walked to the end of the corridor, placed both hands on the windowsill, and looked out at the city that did not yet know what its morning would bring. Catherine rose from her chair. She did not follow him immediately. She waited, as she had learned to wait, for the moment when her presence would be received rather than endured. And when she finally walked to him and placed her hand between his shoulder blades, he did not turn. He simply lowered his head, closed his eyes, and allowed himself for the first time that evening to be a son rather than a successor. They stood at that window for a long time. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She was not the Princess of Wales in that moment, and he was not the heir apparent. They were a husband and a wife, standing in a hospital corridor at the turn of a night that would divide their lives into a before and an after. The city below them glittered with the ordinary indifference of a capital that had not yet been told. And somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour that neither of them would ever forget. She spoke first, eventually, and only once. She said his name, not his title, not any of the honorifics that had accumulated around him over the years. Just his name, softly, the way she had said it on a rain-soaked afternoon in St. Andrews 2 decades earlier, when neither of them had yet imagined the corridors they would one day walk together. That mattered because in the household's long history, the moments that shape a reign are almost never the moments the country sees. They are the moments in which a person is called by their name in the dark by the one person still permitted to use it. He turned to her then. He did not smile. He did not weep. He simply looked at her, and she looked back, and the future, which had been so long postponed, finally arrived between them. By morning, the city had begun to gather. It did not gather in the way it had gathered for previous royal moments. There were no barricades yet. There were no flags. There were only small clusters of people, forming and reforming outside the gates of the hospital, outside Buckingham Palace, outside Clarence House, drawn by an instinct that no news bulletin had yet confirmed. They stood in the cold with their coats pulled tight. They spoke in low voices. They looked up at the windows as if the windows themselves might answer their questions. A woman in a green scarf standing near the hospital gate, with a small bouquet of white roses she had not yet decided where to place, was heard to say, through a quiet voice recorded by a passing broadcaster, that she had not come because the king was ill. She had come because her own father had died in a hospital much like this one, many years earlier, and she wanted the family inside to know that someone outside understood what that corridor felt like. She did not give her name. She did not want to. She placed the roses on the pavement, stepped back, and walked away before anyone could ask her anything further. A newspaper front page, prepared in the small hours and delivered to the stands before dawn, carried a single photograph across its full width. It was not a photograph of the king. It was a photograph of the empty chair in the state dining room, taken by a staff photographer who had not been briefed on why the chair had been removed. Above the photograph, the headline read in stark black letters, "The chair that was not there." Below it, a single line of text, no byline, no explanation. And in living rooms across the country understood, without needing the article beneath, exactly what had happened. A broadcaster, seated at a desk in a studio that had been prepared for a routine morning bulletin, adjusted her earpiece, looked into the camera, and delivered a framing line that would be quoted for years afterward. She said, without embellishment, that the country had woken to a morning in which the king was still the king, but the reign, in every practical sense, had already begun to belong to someone else. She did not name the someone else. She did not need to. Inside the hospital, the transfer that had begun the previous evening was now complete. Charles had been moved to a quieter wing, farther from the main entrance, closer to a small chapel that the household had used, on and off, for more than a century. William had returned briefly to Kensington Palace to change his clothes, and to speak, for a few minutes, with his children. Catherine had remained at the hospital, seated in a small waiting room, reading the same page of a book for nearly an hour without turning it. The folder that had been withdrawn from the locked drawer had been delivered by hand to a small office in Buckingham Palace, where it now sat on a desk beneath a green banker's lamp, waiting for a signature that had not yet been requested. The diary that had been rewritten was already being distributed in its new form to the household officers who would need to act upon it. The chair that had been removed from the state dining room remained in its storage room, still covered with its soft cloth, still waiting for the initials that would replace those of the king. And in the corridor outside the king's new room, a single figure stood alone for a moment, unobserved by any camera, unaccompanied by any aid. William leaned his forehead lightly against the wall, closed his eyes, and allowed himself, for perhaps 5 seconds, the private grief of a son who had just watched his father accept the end of a story neither of them had wanted to end. Then he straightened. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket. He walked back into the room where his father was waiting, and where his wife would soon join him, and where the country's next chapter had, quietly, without proclamation, already begun. The painful truth that William and Catherine revealed, in the hours that followed, was not a diagnosis. It was not a prognosis. It was not a statement about medicine, or timelines, or the specific nature of the king's condition. The painful truth was simpler, and heavier, and more human than any of those things. It was that the man at the center of the monarchy was tired. It was that the family around him had known for longer than they had been able to say. It was that the transfer of the king from one wing of the hospital to another had not been a medical decision alone. It had been the moment at which a father, a sovereign, and a son had finally agreed, in silence, that the weight of the crown could no longer be carried by the hands that had carried it for so brief a chapter. They did not release a statement in the traditional sense. They allowed instead a small photograph to be circulated through the household's private channels, which then found its way, as such photographs always do, into the public record. The photograph showed William and Catherine standing side by side in the hospital corridor, not touching, not smiling, not posing. It showed two people who had been asked to hold a country steady, and who had in the private hours of a long night agreed to do so. The photograph was not captioned. It did not need to be. The country understood. In the days that followed, the machinery of the household would continue to move. The folder on the desk beneath the green banker's lamp would be opened. The diary would be finalized. The chair in the storage room would be uncovered and remarked. Ministers would be briefed. Commonwealth leaders would be informed. Prayers would be offered in cathedrals across the country and beyond. And through all of it, William and Catherine would move with the particular composure of two people who had already lived through the hardest hours of the transition in a hospital corridor that no one else had been permitted to enter. Charles, for his part, would rest. He would receive his son and his daughter-in-law, and in time his grandchildren, in a room that had been arranged for comfort rather than protocol. He would read when he could. He would sleep when he needed to. He would look, from time to time, at the small folded note he had once written to William and had asked, through a household intermediary, to be returned to him for a single afternoon. He would read it. He would fold it again. He would hand it back. And the note would return to the inner pocket of William's jacket, where it had lived for so long, and where it would remain for the rest of the reign that was now quietly beginning. Charles gave the country honesty. William gave it endurance. Catherine gave it grace. And the monarchy, which had been rehearsing this moment for longer than any of them had been willing to admit, gave the country the one thing it had always, in its most difficult hours, been designed to give: continuity in the face of what could not be continued, and steadiness in the face of what could not be steadied, and the calm, unadorned, unspoken passage of a burden from one generation to the next. The corridor is empty now. The lamp in the small office beneath the green shade still burns. The chair in the storage room waits beneath its soft cloth. The diary has been distributed. The folder has been opened. The note is folded in an inner pocket, close to a heart that will carry it for the rest of a life. And somewhere, in a room that no camera will ever enter, a father and a son sit side by side, saying very little, understanding everything. That is the painful truth that William and Catherine revealed. Not in a press conference, not in a statement, but in the quiet, deliberate, unbearable dignity of the way they walked into that hospital and the way they walked out. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.